Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to a platform conversation with Toril Johannessen. We opened the festival exhibition 2024 2 days ago, titled Deterrence and Reassurance. And we're using this beautiful Saturday afternoon for an opportunity to talk a bit more with the artist about some of the contexts, thoughts in the show, and just as an opportunity to catch up actually on everything that happens downstairs. My name is Axel Vida. I'm director of Bergen Kunsthall, and together with Celia Leifsdottir, curator of the exhibition. We have today the opportunity to live stream the conversation, hence the cameras in the room, which are placed in the back. So there are some angles on which people are not visible in case you prefer not being seen. And we aim to talk for about 45 minutes and have a possibility afterwards for a Q&A. And again, because of the live stream, I would like to ask everyone asking a question to use the microphone that we're passing around to be actually also hearable on the live stream and the recording. Thank you to the live team for facilitating the event today. Henrik Skauge, Nora Santje Almes, Sophia Marie Hamnes, and Thea Haug, and also for the arranging of the space and the cleaning up afterwards. Yes, a brief introduction still to Toril Johannessen. She grew up in Harstad, but lived a long time of her adult life in Bergen. Started here at the Art Academy. We met for the first time when you relocated for some years to Tromsø. I was there with my then colleague Steiner for a studio visit, but you're back in Bergen since a few years. And the Bergen connection is very sensible in a way when following your artistic practice. On the one hand, you have exhibited a lot in the city, in many places, at Bergen Kunsthall, Entrée, Trykkeriet comes to mind. You also have two very prominent artistic commissions in the city, one just across the pond here at Rothuse, a photographic curtain work. But you have also exhibited broadly internationally or widely at Documenta 12 2013 in Kassel, the 13th Istanbul Biennial, at museums such as the former Museum of Contemporary Art, which is now part of Nationalmuseet, at Munch Museum in various capacities, also at Munch Museum on the Move, together with Marjolein Dijkman, and at Aros, the Aros Kunstmuseum. And your work is currently actually on view also with the collaboration with Marjolein at the Atlantic Ocean exhibition at Henie Onstad. This is to map out the kind of significance of your work that's important also for the festival exhibition as a format, this reaching out both towards the international audience and significance, but also being really someone who has significance here for local or regional discussions. As an artist, you work in a conceptual way and often researching how historical conditions and technological developments impact perception and representation. We get a bit closer to some of these topics then to make them more concrete. But what's obvious is like you often work with information, or rather how information is presented and framed through normative or notions that you make up by yourself. You also work with information systems that you develop yourself. And often in your work you observe how various kinds of scientific research relate to other forms of knowledge and belief. And what's also important to notice, there's a lot of information in your work that is interesting to talk about. It's in a way about storytelling, which is not really a notion I would use normally, but it's preparing the talk. I noticed there is really like a lot to talk about, so we will tell some stories, I guess. And to start with, some of the topics that appear in the exhibition here, I actually heard about in relation to your work for the first time in a presentation at Berg. That was 2 or 3 years ago. And you presented 2, at that point, ongoing projects for public artworks. And these both related to the north of Norway, to parts of the history and contemporary reality of military presence. And yeah, one could say geostrategic relevance of the North, but they also both related very closely to your own biography and maybe how this military presence impacts people's lives and how it impacts also nature and how we perceive nature. And this is a good starting point into the conversation also because these 2 public artworks remained at the core of the conceptual outline of the exhibition here. And that's interesting in various ways. On the one hand, it talks about the longevity of your artistic work. It's often really kind of a longer strand of investigation that continues over several occasions to actually show work. In relation to the exhibition here, it's also interesting because it mixes locations that are somewhere else and the exhibition space here. It brings other locations in a way into the exhibition space in a way that reminded me somehow on land art practices, that an object is often able to talk about where it's from and also about what it is in itself. And yeah, maybe go into some images. This is one of these 2 commissions, a work that was commissioned by Koro for an airbase in Evenes. And yeah, maybe could you talk a bit about the history of this project and how you tried to, or how you handled this commission and some of the complications that lie in there?
First of all, I actually like to say I'm very happy that you bring up BEC, Bergen Center for Electronic Arts, because that's actually where I first made a connection between those 2 public projects that you mentioned in public. One unrealized project, which will not be realized, which is part of the show as a sort of an excerpt of the process, and this, the project for Koro. So it was a part of the did a presentation at the BEC Symposium in 2022. And at the time, these works were not finished. So I was contacted by curators for a project, a Koro project by Jan Freuchen and Linn Pedersen in 2020, if I would consider make a proposal for works for the Evenes airbase or air station, which is a military part of the Evenes air station. And I thought it was intriguing and interesting to look at, very much because it's very close to where I'm from. Evenes is the airport I would fly in and out from to reach Harstad, and it's sort of my neighborhood in a way. So that was one reason, but also just realizing that the landscape or my environment in Harstad growing up there, it was full of these military installations and winter exercises and a military presence, but which was always felt very removed, or it was very far from my daily life, and maybe also not something that I didn't really see. So it kind of presented an opportunity to look at the region of northern Norway and the wider region in a new way for me. It took some time to get started. It took actually a year before I got on the first site visit, which was at the Andenes air station, which was then planned to be discontinued because the squadron was moving from Andenes to Evenes, which is why they commissioned works also. So that took some time, mainly because of COVID. So I started in 2021 and started drafting this idea with working with maps of nordområdene, or covering different parts of this region. So what you're looking at here is from the spisesal, the dining area at the air station.
And it's also maybe just in terms of format interesting because it's a site-specific work, but it takes on a very transportable format. It's prints that are relatively modest in size. They're large for silk screens, but for flat, specifically made works, they are still considerably. It's possible to transport them, and also as prints, they actually have an edition that's bigger than one. So, as I understood, like for many reasons, you're attracted to silk screening, but one of the possibilities is also to actually show it somewhere else, to keep it not just in this location there.
Yeah, that was important for me because I knew I would be working on this for a while, and it would make most sense to me to work on something that would be also possible to present somewhere else. And that was why I chose to make it small. It's not a big edition, but a small edition of prints, so that it could be also accessible to a public outside of the restricted area.
And maybe we jump to the exhibition here. They have been shown in the meantime also at a selection of these works were shown at OSL in a gallery in Oslo. But it was further expanded now here for the exhibition at Bergen Kunsthall. And we're starting with one element of this series. So it was a series shown in Evenes, but one element of the series is now expanded into a 5-part series, which is about colloquial place names linked to military activity. And so in Evenes, there's a map which shows Nordland, and where you started research on these names specific to the location of the airbase, the commission, and now it's covering a bigger scope of Norway. Do you want to talk about the content of these maps? It's a bit hard to see on this image.
Yeah.
Go into the detail.
So this was part of the series made for Koro and the Evenes Air Station, which is, by the way, called Presence, or Tilstedeværelse, the series of 6 prints. And this is a map where I have collected exactly what the title says, or more or less exactly, colloquial place names linked to military activity. And it's a collection of nicknames or colloquial place names for seen from a civilian perspective, which is important here, I think, to mention. In Northern Norway, in the time period from 1940 till today, that in some way has something to do with Forsvaret, or the defense, or armed forces, or wartime history, but also in some cases conflicts that happens elsewhere, but are kind of comes from associations to those conflicts in Norway. So it started with just realizing that this is a phenomena. In Stø, which is a fishing village where my grandma was from, there's a little radar station, or not little, but there's a little peak with the radar station on top of it. It's sort of hovering over the village. And I never knew it as anything else than NATO-fjellet, as I could remember, or NATO-toppen, I think maybe some people say. And just realized that I didn't know the real name of it, because it was a popular hiking route going across that mountain. And found some images of, I think it was from the 50s, with the tagline at Digitalt Museum, tagline, view from the NATO mountain. And I thought, oh, that's certainly Stø. But it wasn't. It was in Honningsvåg. So I was like, but that, well, of course there are more NATO mountains and NATO roads and NATO docks and these kind of place names, and started looking into that and searching for that. Firstly, maybe just in written sources, and then deciding to try to cover the region or the landsdel of northern Norway to look for within this time period. And started asking, or I contacted a lot of history organizations, museums, and also it's a lot of like looking through local newspapers or searching through local newspapers and other documents to make a collection of this kind of names. So other examples are, and many of them are the same, or the same kind of names are in many different parts, also showed later in the country. Like Radiohåla, for example, which is like a radio, typically a little cave or a hiding place for a radio during World War II, when radios were illegal, or a more creatively dubbed BBC in in Sortland. So you find a lot of like, there's a lot of, you know, very informal, kind of fun to many of the names also, but some of them also with darker histories.
I mean, specifically talking about the North, for me it was initially also surprising to see actually that there is such a huge and sensible, like noticeable presence of the military. And so, yeah, when we talked about it, some of the reasons are clear. For example, the border to Russia. And this sounds abstract, and maybe still it's not the most densely populated area. But then also talking to you, and also maybe in preparation of the project, talking to others, and it is clear that it has an impact on people who live there, actually. Hence, it's a discussion, and I guess these maps also give a testimony to this importance on people's minds of military. And initially, maybe one might have a more critical notion of military, but being dependent on security is also something that makes this evaluation a bit more complicated. Could you talk about this political aspect in the work?
Or in me?
On you, yeah.
Yeah, there's no doubt that also consideration when taking on a commission for, not for Koro, but for Forsvaret. Or it's for Koro, but anyway, knowing where it's what's gonna be for. That was, it had me thinking a lot about many things that I haven't been so acutely aware of or thinking about, I think, because as I guess I mentioned, that I always felt that Forsvaret was very much at a distance, even though it was very close. It was living in the same landscape, but still it was very far from my daily experience and from what I actually saw. So I had to do some thinking when it came to what does it mean to make something for a place that is closed, restricted, and also in the end is also a part of an institution that is also sanctioned violence. But my conclusion was also that it is a part of it's a public institution that in a way also represents me somehow. And I thought it was interesting to go into this also for exploring that for myself, I think. So also after visiting, of course, I got a little bit more insight into tiny bit insight into the institution, but also started reading more about well, the recent security politics in Norway.
Yeah, the title is also a very direct hint to that. Deterrence and Reassurance. Maybe you can pronounce the Norwegian original wording.
Avskrekking og beroligelse.
Yeah. Which you, it's not just a. I mean, it's and it is an interesting notion also to think about one's own relationship to it. This kind of sense of, on the one hand, trying to feel safe, but on the other hand, also having the wish to be not too close, actually, to the reality of military. But it is also like a concrete Norwegian military concept.
Or it's a concept in security policies. And it's still valid today, but I guess what we see more or think more about is the deterrence part and not the reassurance, I think. So there are things changing in that landscape as well at the moment, I think. But I was interested in also because culture and art is also part of the reassurance, or this is how I interpret it anyway, as of the reassurance part of the politics. It's diplomacy and cultural diplomacy. It's been quite active in the north in particular, which I found also something to chew on. So how are we getting involved in diplomacy and in security politics also through making art or displaying art? But in the show for the work that is also titled Avskrekking og beroligelse, it's not so much, I haven't been researching and putting a lot of information about that notion or term into that work. It's more about a personal experience or maybe as a psychological notion and all these kind of tensions that might, and motstridende kind of, or attention that can be evoked by this work itself, and maybe also very much how I feel these days, I think, thinking about or being confronted with that, I guess, especially in 2022, that, well, if we didn't have a defense, would that be a better solution? Which would have maybe this rift between an ideal and a realistic, or ideals and realism, I think was put to a test then.
Maybe we go to one more work, which is in the same space as the series of colloquial place names maps, Gallery 1. The biggest work in the exhibition, and also made specifically for this occasion, a series of hand-woven rags, filaria, made from military or textiles, clothing, but also other textiles that were taken out of circulation and that you bought for turning them into filaria. And on the one hand, it's the work presents these materials as actually a physical trace of military, and it's not just the carpet, it's also the smell in a way that, and the feeling, the sense, we're invited to walk on them, so we also can get a very close bodily experience of them. So it's not just an optical experience, but also being really close to them, and the technique, making these carpets, it's also something that takes a while. As I said, they're hand woven, so it's not a conceptual gesture for ordering someone else to make them. You and a team of helpers, assistants, collaborators made them over a quite long period of time. So I understood them also as something that kind of gets close to an experience of something that connects to the military, not just through reading or an intellectual negotiation, but something that is more like an everyday experience. Can you talk about the making of these and the planning?
Yeah, so I suppose this kind of layering, it connects to the colloquial place names work in a way where I was thinking about the layering of the civilian and military in the region, and this is maybe more the interwovenness of the civilian life and the military as an association. But for me, the Fillerøya is, or the Ragrugs, is one of the most hjemlige, like home, something that feels very much like home and safety, and which I have a connection to, just because I have those that my grandma, some of the Ragrugs that my grandma made, and you know, sometimes you need to take it apart, maybe you need to shorten it, or it's a little bit too worn, and you want to take out a part, and all this used clothing kind of comes out, and you can unfold it and see small bits of history. So I guess I've been interested in the Fillerøya for a long time for exactly that. But then thinking of that as something that has to do with a feeling of safety or a home in connection with the military, which again is something more distant and can evoke different feelings. Maybe for some security, but for others more traumatic feelings, if they have an experience with that, or other negative emotions. So that tension is something I wanted to bring together in this work. And another thing, also just the fact that industry is having a big impact. I mean, entire textile industry having a big environmental impact, which is negative and which there are very few solutions for at the moment. So also the norske Forsvaret are actually discarding, 250 to 360 tons of textile materials every year. So when I started thinking about the work that would bring this kind of atmosphere I wanted to bring into the exhibition, and also, I don't know, it was not only the making of that work, but something to walk on, something that transforms the gallery. That was like the general thinking first, but then comes the question, so how do I do this, and where do I get the materials? And that took a while. I checked with Forsvarsmateriell, who takes care of materials. There was no possibility of getting hold of anything there. So it was on the second-hand market, you could say, that I got hold of these materials. And a lot of it just random, buying big crates with the leftovers that was not possible to sell for those who's dealing in that market. And some things at Finland and different places. But also, I don't know how to weave. So how did I do this? I did check if there would be possibilities, or how would it be to produce it, or that someone else would produce it. But I realized that it's not what I wanted, and it would actually be more complicated to work with form and to get it in the way that I wanted. So then I had to learn, and I was so lucky to get a crash course from Inge Bjørgmonsen at Bjørgvin Husflidslag, and some amazing assistants, Margrethe Kule and Sofie Widwinter, and also Marte Dahl and Henriette somewhere, who also helped out at the very end when things were a bit more chaotic. So we set up a studio, got an extra studio for this, and 2 looms, and started cutting into strips and learning how to set up the loom. So the weaving technique is not complicated, but to set it up requires a minimum of skills. But I think I had the confidence that I could do it because I'd been analyzing my grandma's rugs. But I wasn't entirely sure, I have to admit. But yeah, but with the help of amazing helpers, we've been weaving and cutting and weaving for months. Yeah. Yeah.
And I just want to mention that there is this kind of like there's this one aspect which is really just about mass and like amount, basically, like to bring to create a space that's full of discarded military remnants in this other form. But then there is also this level of detail in this picture now, for example, where in a very kind of nice way the kind of previous use becomes visible through small, how do you call it, like stuff that's in the clothing or so, that is kind of just woven in. And or here, yeah, this one with the the pieces of the Norwegian flag, for example, where it starts to tell more than just this conceptual outline. This is military clothing.
Yeah, I wanted to keep it like on a formal level, kind of similar to the way you would weave something for a home, but leaving in some parts a little bit more things that you would otherwise take out, like buttons or labels and things like that. But another thing is that I think there's, and I haven't been like looking very much into it, but just knowing that use of military surplus materials or leftovers after is maybe more so after wars, because the military apparatus has, has taken all resources, and then you have to be creative of how to make the things you need and make use of the materials that are available. So, for instance, wedding gowns made from what's called parachute silk, or other things made from these kind of leftovers. It's also a very pragmatic way of transforming one thing into something else and something usable.
And then there's also something very interesting that the work does to the exhibition spaces, because first of all, for pragmatic reasons, we had to think about ways to make people take off their shoes, because the work could not sustain like being walked on, specifically not knowing how the weather will be. But then this became also actually really an active gesture in the exhibition space, that the atmosphere changes by people going from a street outfit to something that you're more used doing at home or in leisure time. So it became this kind of installation, like a wardrobe or a barnehage, changing shelf, where you transition, or a threshold basically that you pass, and then you're in this other space, and it's maybe like you feel more private, and it really does something to people, like sometimes a bit silly, but definitely you change your mindset and experience the space differently.
I can imagine that for some it feels nice, and for some it's maybe a little bit too exposing, or you feel vulnerable also taking your shoes off in a public space.
Yeah.
And many have had the feedback that they're just very interested in the tactility, and that it feels so different to walk on these different types of materials.
Yeah, there's some ultra soft ones. Which, yeah, we didn't speak.
Actually, the woven sleeping bag turned out to be very popular for actually lying down, I saw.
Yeah, but we spoke a bit about it, but there's because there is also this uneasiness about the material, and these soft ones are for me a bit like that. It's almost too soft, and too artificial, or you start to wonder what it actually is. And for me, the fact that you're walking across this military textiles isn't generally maybe it has an association of uneasiness, something that is there, and you become aware only gradually what it actually is, and which is for me a bit connected to an experience of military as an infrastructure and as something that's part of public life, very much that this has in general. Like I still feel uncomfortable with being confronted by the fact that military is part of our everyday life.
Same.
Yeah. Maybe we go a bit back to the larger picture of politics. This is from a series that's shown in Gallery 3. It's the definition of the High North, or Nordområdene, through the decades. And this is maybe pointing to the fact that even what we define as the High North is, or what is defined as the High North, is very much dependent on political lines and constellations. So it's not just a geographical location, and the map which shows the Nordområdene is not just a geographical description. It's actually very much influenced by politics and conflict lines. So there's a lot of research in that, and could you talk us a bit through the rough outline of this?
So it's this one is not in English, so how do I translate it? It's a forsøksvis stedsfesting av nordområdene I norsk politisk landskap. So it's really an attempt to locate the High North in a political landscape. So absolutely not it's absolutely not a place, nordområdene or the High North. But still, it also is, and that's what I was interested in looking at. So my starting point was, or I used the term as it was defined by Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, NUPI, Norsk Utenrikspolitisk Institutt. In the 70s, I started using the notion of nordområdene to talk about or to describe international relations. And at the time, it had mostly to do with marine areas in the north, that is Barentshavet and relation to Russia. But later, it has been adopted by... So, as far as I understand, NUPI's claimed the term a bit, and it has later been adopted by politicians, and in the political discourse, it has meant a lot of different things, or that it's been pointing toward different kind of outlines of the region of what they mean when they say nordområdene. So starting from being actually more or less the Barents Sea and Svalbard, it was later, well, in my interpretation, it goes to the first one is the 70s, 80s. Next one, 90s, around 2000, 2006, and a little bit after 2010, and then from, our time. 2020 is a little bit before, a little bit after. It's all very approximate. But there's been this nordområdeutredninger and other reports about the High North, and that is part of my some of my sources, but also I've been looking at some other articles. Other academics have been trying to do the same, to try to define or try to figure out what the politicians actually mean when they say the High North, what it implicates. And the different reports like this, NOU, which is like National Norsk Offentlig Utredning, public reports. So some of, so it's screen printed maps of a circumpolar map. Bit hard to read, I guess. Also, again, deliberately. Also quickly to mention that there's another layer of information in those 5 different maps, which is the sea ice extent around the same time. So this is the sea ice extent in March and September of 2000. And so you can also, so if you look closely, you can also see how the sea ice in the Arctic has shrunk since 1980, as a sort of a association and pendant to this sort of fluidity of the region. But in this case, actually, the sea ice is more solid than the ocean itself. So this is the A-map definition. So I painted with aquarelle an indication of what was meant, or the definition of nordområdene in this around this time, and this is the A-map definition of the Arctic. So compared to the original nordområdene NUPI definition from the 70s, it's now encompassing a much larger region. Later it has come to mean other things. Today, maybe it's a little bit more back to what it originally meant in some versions of it, but still, I guess it's also more awareness of the global implications of and climate change and what it does to the whole Arctic region, and that also influences Norwegian nordområdepolitikk.
But the politics of the High North, I mean, you said like now a discussion on climate change, but there is also, it's also defined by the relationship to Russia.
Yes. Yeah.
And the Cold War and the kind of attempt to get closer afterwards. And also, I guess, resources. I think like it's because it's resources and research also that are important factors for the North and exploitation or extraction.
Which it has been for a long time, I think. But I think for me, I also got interested in the notion around or remembering. Well, I made a little note for myself, a list that I put on my studio wall when I started the whole map project, because I was a little bit confused. Because I was like, oh, I want to make maps, and it has to do with Northern Norway. Or does it have to do with Northern Norway? Maybe it's nordområdene, or is it the North, or is it the Arctic, or is it Barents region, or is it Nordkalotten? And I got a bit, so I had this list of all these different names for the regions, and so, and just then realized more like actively thinking about that some of these notions are geographical, some are political. But in 2006, Jonas Gahr Støre was, I think that was in 2006. You can correct me afterwards. But I very clearly remember when he is foreign minister, kind of gave new life to the nordområdene policy and spoke a lot about it, about nordområdene. And I was very happy in the south, thinking that, oh, this is about Northern Norway, and that Northern Norway gets some more attention and better possibilities for infrastructure and whatever. And then just very much later realized that it's not about the terrestrial, it's about the foreign relations. And he was probably clear, but still I think the message that came across was also that it was more attention to Northern Norway and the people who lived there. And I think that has created some confusion. So that's also partly why I got interested in the notion.
Yeah, one last network maybe to talk about. It is actually about the people in the north. I and we, a diptych you made, and I wanted to talk about these briefly, also in relation to their investigation of mapping methodologies and your interest in mapping, but maybe important to briefly say that both these maps or these works map language and how it's used. It's not just the main languages that we associate, but it's really also official dialects and how these express the words for I and we. And in a way, like, so these two works contain a lot of information, but they also experiment with a way of like representing this very much so. And I was reminded on mapping discourses that are actually still current, but that I also followed since many years. We have a talk later in the duration of the exhibition with a cartographer, Filip Rekacevic, who worked for many years on making maps, and that he designs with the intention to actually clearly articulate the intention of the map. So not to hide behind a neutral language, but to put the intention to the front and turn it into an argument and use maps as a way of political argumentation. And in a way, I see these two works also in a similar strand of thought, like trying to point something else out through a map that's more subjective and where the research is more visible, kept visible. But they are also artworks because they're silk screen. They're not interested in translating that into a contemporary form of cartography, let's say as a digital map or so. Could you talk about this tension for you between information on the one hand, but also very clearly positioning these works as artworks in an exhibition?
I think that then I have to go back to my intention with the work, which was not cartographic, but or to say something, or not to map out a linguistic situation in Nordkalotten. So this is Nordkalotten. That was not the purpose of the work. It was more to talk about the region identities, the presence of people, and the tensions between the individual and the collective. But then, in order to do that, I just had to do all the research to find out. Because what I wanted to do was to find ways of saying I and we in language, in the languages spoken in the region. And I suppose I envisioned the image before starting on doing the research. So in this case, and this is not always the case with how I'm working, but in this case I had a sort of a vision of what it would look like as well, and with what kind of methods, with these little hand stamps and all of that. But one thing leads to another, and it was obvious that I needed to make some kind of avgrensning, some kind of limit to which languages to include, and then I found it natural to, or in the end it became limited to national minority languages, national majority languages, and indigenous languages, those who are official in this region. But it also turns out then to be a map of, well, a linguistic map, and also a map of, or two different maps with two different types of representation that also shows how there's such a, it's multicultural and multilinguistic region, which is crossing the borders of the national borders of this region. And that is also became a motivation in the work also to trace that a bit.
And specifically also in a moment when the border actually becomes much less, when it's much more difficult actually to work across or to pass even the border to Russia. Maybe we jump over one work and we go to the last. complex of work in the exhibition that I wanted to mention, which is relating to this to the second public artwork that is unrealized, a memorial that was planned for a former campsite of Soviet prisoners of war, and the presentation in the exhibition traces the planning process a bit, but also points to reasons of that is actually not realized. Could you give us an outline of the project?
Yeah, so this is another project I was asked in 2020 to give a pitch. Like, you have 2 weeks, and can you give us a small input to a project about prisoners of war in Soviet prisoners of war in Bjørnelva on Saltfjellet, and that was supposed to be the last part of a longer project initiated by Riksantikvaren, Narviksenteret, and others, and Nordland fylkeskommune, which had to do with researching the history of these prisoners of war, because it has been a story that has been not entirely forgotten, but hasn't been given that much attention from World War II and in the post-war period. So I was asked to come with an idea for something, or not really an idea, but just a little outline of what my thoughts were, and then asked to collaborate with a Russian architect, Tatiana Gorbachevskaya. So we started that work in late 2020 for our first site visit. At Bjørnelva there's a camp. So this history project was not about, because there were Soviet prisoners of war throughout Norway, building infrastructure, and this was particularly about building of the railway and roads across Saltfjellet in Nordland. So there were over 50 camps up through Nordland, and Bjørnelva was one of them, where many people died and suffered. And after the war ended, they erected, as many others did, they erected a monument for themselves made from cement blocks and materials that they had available close by. But in the 1950s, many of these, the Norwegian authorities had a sort of cleanup operation when it came to the memory of the Soviet prisoners of war. So this monument at Bjørnelva was demolished, and the leftovers of it is kept there today. So today, this is the monument of the prisoners of war in Bjørnelva, and also a monument to politics of forgetting, you could say. So starting up a project, a history project about, and also planning a memorial for this history in 2016, also is a reflection and a self-critical reflection on the politics of forgetting and the politics of memory. Anyway, we started the project, was supposed to be, or the drawings for that I'm not sharing in the exhibit. It was a path and a architectural construction that was quite large as it happened. But a small part of it, which was also part of my initial draft, was that I proposed to plant edible plants. Many people died from hunger here, and it was meant as a symbolic gesture to give some kind of nourishment. It turned out that in order to bring in the edible plants such as berries, I would do that on an eroded slope next to the camp, and in order to do that you need to use another native plant, salix, Taiwan willow, to revegetate the area, and then the edible plants can come in after. So that before the project was discontinued in 2022, the only thing that materialized was that I did take seedlings of willows in 2021, and it was supposed to be planted in 2022, but the project was discontinued before that. And main reason given was because of sanctions against Russia, and also an impact analysis for the wider area. So all in all, I totally agree that that project should be discontinued, because there's something about making. It was a collaboration also with not Tatiana but other Russian partners, and I believe it's the wrong moment to continue in the same form. But there's something also very sorrowful about the fact that those prisoners who were deliberately forgotten never got, or still haven't got, the memorial that they deserved.
So the plants that were seen under the table are actually these seedlings of the salix plants that survived the past 2 or 3 years in a plant nursery, and were sent to us by post. Survived even the Norwegian post, and are recovering, are recovering in light and in the exhibition space. But I mean, with this project, the history is really important, and I also was surprised to hear about the camps. So these were kind of organized during German occupation by Nazi forces or the German army. So I felt also actually surprised myself that this was an aspect of history of German presence in Norway that I was not aware of. But it also, just by the existence of these camps, gives testimony to the contestedness and the conflicts that run through this, to the northern Norway, and traces such as infrastructure that still remain in place today, that are still used. And in a way, how we started this talk, like the military presence, it's also still a huge element, actually, of infrastructure building. So, part of this investigation of the North and of significance is for me also this thinking about infrastructure and how it relates to people. So besides the formal aspects of having 2 public artworks, for me it's also this kind of bracket of research that's really interesting. But should we maybe open to questions in the audience? If there are, if we ran a bit over time, there's really so much to talk about in the exhibition. We didn't even touch on it all yet. But, so I'm sorry for being too long.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Thank you very much for the talk. I have a question that is regarding this transition from public art to exhibition work. Could you talk a bit more about that? Kind of how the works are, in a way, transformed from one location, which is very much not an art institution, and into the art institution. If there is anything to share.
Well, the work for Evenes Air Station is not transformed in itself, but because the context is different, I'm sure it's going to be read differently as well. When I installed works at Evenes, I realized that it was very much read as information, or looking at the information. And I also have to say that both there and here, a comment is often, oh, there's much more than this. There's many more names than this. And that's also part of it. I'm just pointing at the phenomena, which is much bigger than what I've just barely touching on it in a way. But they were looking for information very much. And I think that maybe that knowledge of that, what these works were made for, will also become a part of the interpretation, I think, of the work and the interpretation history of the work. For the Bjørnelva project, or the seedlings, which I temporarily dubbed it now, it's plants actually, not seedlings anymore, but that's of course, it's not a representation of what the memorial could have been. There are elements in there, so it's more documentation of a small part of the process. I have to admit that initially, when I started thinking that it could be something to bring into this show, I was thinking it should be no form. One A4 sheet and just retell it, it's enough. But I think that the presence of the plants, which is really the only materialized part of my involvement anyway, and that like oversized table and all of that maybe gives it always, that form also gives it a presence or a weight, but it's not meant to be some kind of substitute for the place itself.
For how long will you keep the plants?
Sorry?
For how long will you keep the plants? Will you try to make them survive the situation, or?
Yeah, I will try to make them survive this exhibition.
I know there are
with the lamps, but I'm aware that the temperature is too high at the moment, so I'm hoping for a cold summer. But my plan is if my neighbors agree to at least a few of them, to plant them out. We have a little garden spot where it could work to have some of them. Because, well, they would have been composted. So the reason I have them here is that they would have been composted this year. They went to a plant nursery in Utskarpen in Nordland, and they were just sitting there. So they should have been planted in 22. So they've been 2 years over time, and normally they would have grown much more, but they were kind of on the verge anyway and about to be composted. So taking them here, they're in not a proper shape really. So, but let's see if we can make some of them survive here.
I was wondering about the green color in the exhibition, like why that particular color, or just know more about that.
Well, first of all, I thought it would be good to use a color just to make the space more intimate. So that was the initial purpose of painting the walls at all. And also, I think that the screen prints also kind of pops out a little better on a colored wall or a darker wall. But then I had a bit of an issue with, so what should the color be? Because I didn't want it to be symbolic of anything or one specific thing. So it's not representing one thing. So try to find something. Green is a color that can be associated to many things and which are also relevant in the show, both in the nature and natural landscapes. A representation of forest in maps and also the military, but I try to find a nuance that is a little bit in between. Not quite natural, not quite the military, not quite something in between. That was the attempt anyway.
We made quite a lot of tests actually for
I'm going to try to formulate this very simple, but something that I've been thinking about, because I think that in a way I kind of see you becoming some sort of very important historian of Norway. And I wonder how much accountability of the truth would you like to carry, and would you like your work to carry also in the future? And how much of that responsibility do you think an artist should actually create?
I try to be as accurate as I can with the thing when I present something in a way where it looks like or presents itself as information. But I also, that's also why I say an attempt to visualize or locate or ufullständig, was that? An incomplete collection, yeah. So I try to give these signals that it's not like presenting itself as a truth in a way. But for sure, I'm relying also, or that's what I'm interested in also. I'm interested in our shared reality, not only my personal view on things, but our shared reality and how we can talk about that and think about that. But I would also be very, very careful, I don't call myself an historian, and I hope I'm seen more as an artist than a historian.
I would like to ask you about the element of discovery while you're working with this material, because you have a very direct set of criteria, I assume, when you start off, but you don't really know exactly what you're going to find. So is that a driving force in your artistic practice, this element of discovery?
Yes. Sorry. Yeah, I think I'm motivated by that. Collecting the place names together with Linn Heidi Stokkedal, who did the bulk part of it for the 4 new prints of that covering the other regions in Norway. Like all the histories collected is always a gem to collect, and also not sharing all the history that was also collected, only the place name itself. But I feel it's important to have that kind of knowledge also as part of the process.
Can I add also one point, maybe like even the way that you approach materials or the making of the works, like also silk screening, for example, it's a quite complicated technology if you use it in the way you're using it. But you also did actually much of the printing yourself, meaning also, yeah.
But not the most complicated things.
Okay.
No, I work with Daniel Persson at Tryggeriet for the most complex things, yes.
But still I see that also like as part of an exploration, like what can you do and how does it work, and maybe discovering things that happen along the way that were not really planned, but then become an important part of the work, like in the silk screening, in the weaving, in a series we didn't talk about, the Schablon prints, which are also like very kind of detailed and productive in some of the things that happen alongside along the printing process.
Well, yeah, I think it's. I like putting my hands at work on things, maybe more now than before. Also because you realize when you start learning a technique that it has, like, sometimes the expression itself becomes a function of some restraints, for instance, in the technique. And it's interesting to discover that, and from there on it can take other directions. So in the period of making that, I was only dreaming about how to mix the color and which direction to pull, where the line should come and all of that. It's just like those details is also part of the pleasure of making art.
Should we maybe one more question?
I have a question about, maybe it's a little bit too big for the last, about your position as a political artist. Because it's like you bring very kind of large-scale political issues in, and many other artists, maybe even myself, would easily slide into kind of taking a stand, and the artworks would slide into being propaganda or even activism. But you somehow managed to create a position that if it's not neutral, it's much more subtle in a way, and it's not, the artworks stay inside the artwork, and I think it must be a lot of work to maintain that kind of subtleness instead of being too obviously taking a stand, in a sense.
Well, it's honestly because that's how I feel and think. I feel confronted by, or I feel that it's important to confront my own opinions also. So I'm a little bit ridden by this on one side, on the one hand, on the other hand. That's also hard work and also a bit tiring. Maybe it'd be good to arrive at the conclusion. But that's how the conversation within myself is also going in. But I also find being in those paradoxes and that kind of irresolvability also constructive. Okay, so I'm exaggerating a bit. It's not that I never reach a conclusion, but in this case, it's also a kind of a snapshot of how I felt these past years being confronting when it comes to the topic of the military presence and security politics here. Mm.
Yeah, so it's not really a question, but maybe I thought it was good to just say I'm going to share like an association I have. Now we've been working together for a while. I don't think I shared it before, but I think it's not really an art terminology. But for me, I think you're kind of like a tryllekunstner, like a magician, because it's kind of like you have the hat and you know that the rabbit is there somewhere, but it's hiding and it's been there all the time. You haven't seen it, but then you somehow just take it out and make it visible. And so working with you, for example, the words and the title of the exhibition, Avskrekking, Beroligelse, I don't think I've sort of noticed them before. Now I see the word beroligelse or avskrekking every day in the newspaper. It's probably been there all the time, but you somehow just make them appear. And it's the same with all these things I've taken for granted, also driving across Saltfjellet and learning Blodveien. I never asked any questions why it was called Blodveien. I didn't know the real word of the name of the road. On all these things, you sort of just make them visible. And synliggjør these things you sort of either take for granted or that are hidden as part of like this historical thing. And I think now we've only had the exhibition up for a few days. But what I see, which is also magical, is that you've put this out there, but now it's all the other stories, which are the uformelle and the folkelige stories, because now we see people pointing at all the maps, telling their stories about where they grew up, where they were smoking on the corner, what they thought that roads would mean, and their stories about war memories. Also people being in the military, having military history, recognizing the smell of the tent that they slept in, recognizing the pants that they were wearing. And I've heard already like 40, 50 stories within like 2 days. And so now we're entering this period of you just place this out and now it's collecting all of these other stories from all the people, which I think is really beautiful.
Yeah, then I take this as the final applause. But thank you everybody for coming, and thank you Toril for the wonderful time, exhibition, all the works, and today. you.